Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of Gaudiem at Spes22.com, Podbean podcast, and YouTube video. I'm always excited with my guests, and I always begin my podcast by saying, "Oh, I'm so excited today. I have so and so on the show." But I'm extra excited today to have somebody on the show that I've never interviewed before, who I want my viewers and readers to become very familiar with, and that is Dr. Sarah Shortall, who's Associate Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend. So welcome, Dr. Shortall.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. And anytime I get a Notre Dame person on here, my wife goes crazy happy because she's a domer. She was actually, her senior year as an undergraduate was Lou Holtz's second national championship or whatever it was. So she remembers that year fondly. But that's neither here nor there. We're here to discuss Dr. Shortall's first book. She's working on new books, and which we'll talk about eventually. But her first book, and for those who are just listening, I'm going to read the title, then I'll hold up the book for those who are watching. The book is called Soldiers of God in a Secular World, Catholic Theology and 20th Century French Politics. And for those who are viewing, here it is. Okay, oops, it's backwards, whatever. But it's because I mirrored the image. Anyway, Catholic Theology and 20th Century French Politics, Soldiers of God in a Secular World. And what the book is a kind of really wonder. This is why I love it. I love it. It's a wonderful combination of theology, the history of religious ideas, the interfacing of religion and politics, philosophy, cultural history, and with a great emphasis on French cultural history and French politics. And one of the central points of the book, Soldiers of God in a Secular World, is that so much of the debates that drove 20th century Catholic theology, something near and dear to my heart. In fact, I'm working on an article right now on that topic, hopefully be out in a few days. Uh, so much of those debates were framed within a sort of political and theological discourse that arose in France, kind of in between the two wars. And so rather than going through all of this stuff myself, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Shortall, and I'm going to ask her if you could lead us into first the sort of main thesis that's the engine that drives the book. And then maybe we could begin by going into some of the particulars of like the debate between de Lubach and Lagrange, Action Française and Catholic Action, those things. So go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I should say first of all that I'm a historian rather than a theologian. So I approach this from a historical perspective. First and foremost, I'm trained as an intellectual historian, a historian of ideas. So that's sort of the direction that I come at this from, which is maybe distinct from the way that a theologian might approach these figures. And so it is a book about the what's known often as the Nouvelle Théologie, though that was a name that the participants themselves did not like. It was initially established as a critique of them, but that's usually the way that they're known today. So I use it. And it's a group of Jesuits, people like Henri de Lubac, people might be familiar with, as well as less familiar figures like Gaston Fessard, Yves de Montcheuil, Jean Danielou is also very well known, and then Dominicans like Yves Congar and Marie-Dominique Chenu. So these are figures associated with ressourcement as the other term that's usually used for this. So the book is really about them, but more broadly, it's about what the political role of theology is in a secular context, because all of these figures were coming of age at a very particular moment in French history, when there was this incredibly bitter and polarizing, it was actually called a war, the War of the Two Frances, between the church, Catholics, who tended to be critics of the Republic in France, tended to be monarchists, and the secular Republic that reemerged in France in 1870. This is called the Third Republic. And one of the first things that it does is it tries to really undermine the power of the Catholic Church, which had been obviously such a thorn in the side of Republican politics since the French Revolution. And so it passes a number of laws. It exiles the Jesuits first and foremost. They're usually because these sorts of campaigns happen across Europe in this period, and the Jesuits are always the
Oh, the
first.
poor Jesuits. They always get their butts kicked out first, don't they? Yeah.
Yeah. So they exile the
Didn't
Jesuits.
Bismarck kick him out of Germany too?
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes.
And Latin
Roundabout.
America. Yeah,
Yeah.
everyone's worked up about the Jesuits. So they get kicked out in 1880, and then there's broader legislation at the turn of the 20th century that essentially kicks out all of the religious orders in France, basically. And it leads eventually to the separation of church and state in 1905. And so this is when the French Republic becomes laïque, becomes secular, and it's kind of the form that it currently still takes, right? And so contemporary debates in France about Islam, for example, headscarves, are all in the context of that turn of the century legislation, which established this secular republic. But it was this incredibly bitter campaign that drove all of these religious into exile because effectively they could no longer continue their vocations within France. And so this is the context that the Nouvelle Theologie is coming out of. And these figures also, because of this legislation, were mobilized to serve in World War I. So usually not in combat roles, of course, but they served as stretcher bearers or chaplains, and that also had a really powerful influence on them because they tended to come, especially for the Jesuits, from very wealthy elite backgrounds where they were a little bit sheltered from the working class. And of course, their religious vocation also sheltered them in a way. So it brought them into contact with regular people in a way that really shocked them as to how far most Frenchmen had moved away from the church. And so this is what really catalyzes their interest in trying to bring the church and the modern world back together in some way. And so it's that experience of exile because they have to conduct their religious formation in exile because of these
The
laws.
Jesuits went to Jersey, one of the Channel Islands, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's sort of one of the interesting quirks of this story is that the Jesuits end up in Jersey, which is a Channel island, so it's under the British Crown, but it's like 14 miles off the coast of Normandy, so it's
Right.
as close as you can get to France without being in it. And this has a really formative effect on them, I argue. And so basically to cut a long story short, the key thesis of the book is that the effect of the separation of church and state and this secularization of French public life is actually kind of counterintuitive because it actually serves to promote and revitalize Catholic theology in important ways. And so these guys will go on to develop the theology that becomes foundational to Vatican II. So there's a kind of
Yes.
irony, I guess, to the anti-clerical legislation.
Yeah, I mean, it spurs this creativity that just hadn't existed before. I've often maintained, for example, that the best thing that ever happened to the papacy was the loss of the papal states, because it in a sense removes the papacy from the intrigue of trying. I mean, I there's a church on the Via della Conciliazione leading up to the Vatican, the Transpatina, that was not in its current location. It used to be closer to the Tiber, and yet it had to be deconstructed and moved because the people who had artillery at Castle Gandolfo, at San Angelo, they they, they were saying that the church was in the way. They were shooting up at the Janiculum. So you know, that is a reminder there that Hadrian's old tomb was used by the popes to defend the papal states, and so yeah, it was kind of liberating when the popes didn't have to do that anymore, and I think it was liberating for some of these Jesuits and Dominicans as well. But what happens? Okay, so the Dominicans are up in Belgium, and then the Jesuits are over here in the Channel Islands. All right, but then all of a sudden, the World War I is over, and then there's this great flourishing of new theology and new ideas. The 1930s roll in. We have to talk about the modernist crisis, correct? Loisy, Terrell, Pascendi, Pius X, the atmosphere that creates the neo-scholastic revival begun by Leo XIII. All of that creates this perfect storm, this witch's brew of sort of intellectual repression that in the 1930s gets these Nouvelle theologians sort of the beginnings of being in hot water. And so it's sort of you see it as a condensed symbol in the debates between de Lubac and Lagrange. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Mhm. Yeah, so that the Lubach-Lagrange debate is a little bit later post-war when we have the conflict over the Nouvelle Theologie. But
Yeah.
basically, if we go back to that earlier period of their formation on Jersey, we can see it, I think, best in their conflict with their teachers, who were very much raised in that neo-scholastic environment, and they sort of recapitulate some of the same critiques that Lagrange will eventually make as well. So basically, as you said, at the time, the church was really dominated by this neo-scholastic form of philosophy. Leo the 13th had revived the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas as the central philosophy of the Catholic Church in the 1870s. And initially, he sees this as a way to open the church up or put it in dialogue with modern ways of thinking, because Thomism is highly rationalist, and so it can kind of do battle with modern rational philosophies on their own terms. But then with the modernist crisis, as the church becomes increasingly kind of hostile to the modern world and its political and intellectual formations, it becomes this kind of defensive rampart against any other forms of theology, against any willingness to engage with modern philosophies since Kant, basically. And so it becomes this kind of defensive crouch in a way. And so that's the theology that de Lubac and his friends, their teachers on Jersey, were raised in. And it's a very kind of ahistorical way of thinking. It's based on these manuals, these 19th century manuals, and it's not actually based on a reading of the original sources of the tradition, the church fathers, Aquinas himself. So it's based on these manuals. And so part of what they end up wanting to do is actually go back to those original sources to try to understand where the tradition is coming from. And they actually argue that this scholastic model is not traditional. It's an invention of the 16th century commentators on Thomas Aquinas and then these 19th century manuals. So even though it is anti-modern, they argue it's actually deeply modern and not at all
Yes.
traditional. And so that's a big part of the critique.
Yeah, I mean that deeply modern too, in a sense, it's not only geared towards a kind of rationalism. It's a sort of deductive method of rationalism with an eye towards certitude, epistemic certitude, with an eye towards proving things. That really is more a mindset of the post-Enlightenment sort of philosophical trend. What are the foundations of things? How do we know this is true? Than it is a historically Catholic way of thinking.
Mhm.
But anyway, yes. So we get this as you know. I did my dissertation on Hans Urs von Balthasar, and one of the favorite, my favorite quotes from him is when talking about his own biography. He says that as a young Jesuit scholastic, he languished in the desert of neo-scholasticism. Now, I have friends who say, "Oh, you're so hard on the neo-scholastics. They don't deserve that kind of a caricature." The Nouvelle theologians engaged in a cartoonish caricature of the neo-scholastic manuals. That there was actually a great deal of great thought from neo-scholastic thinkers like Journet and Lagrange himself. And I think that's true. Therefore, to a great extent, I think some of what drives the debates is the political atmosphere in France, and you do such a great job of unpacking that. Uh, so maybe we could talk about it. Like what's the difference between the politics of Garrigou-Lagrange and the politics of Henri de Lubac?
Yeah, so Garrigou-Lagrange is very much raised in the most common political framework for French Catholics in this period, which is support for the Action Française. So the Action Française is this kind of far right nationalist party led by this guy Charles Maurras. There's a sort of irony that Maurras himself is not a believer, but he was a big fan of Thomas Aquinas, of Aristotle. And I think what he liked about Catholicism was what he saw as the kind of hierarchy, the authoritarian aspects of it. And so there were many Catholics who got on board with the Action Française because of that kind of kinship. And because he was a royalist, he wanted to reestablish the monarchy, and that is the kind of traditional position of French Catholics since the French Revolution, basically, since Joseph de Maistre and the whole counter-revolutionary tradition in France. And so that is the tradition that Garrigou-Lagrange comes out of. It's also the one that many of the figures I'm talking about come out of, but they push back against it, they turn on it. It's the tradition that Jacques Maritain comes out of, but he shifts
Yeah, he
after
does.
the condemnation of the Action Française by the Pope in 1926. And the Pope actually invites him to Rome and kind of um, tasks him with leading the resistance to the Action Française. And so that precipitates his own shift on questions of democracy and human rights. So
Why did the Pope
that's the
condemn
default.
Action Française? Because
Right.
go ahead.
Yeah, so it was because of these issues that Maurras himself was not a believer, that it led to a kind of a nationalism that put nation above the church,
Okay, right.
and that it was kind of neo-pagan in some of those ways. So in a way, it anticipates a little bit the critique of fascism that some of these figures will make. And modernists like Blondel, or you can argue about his relationship to modernism, but people in that vein were among the staunchest critics of the Action Française, not just for its politics, but also because of the philosophy that underpinned it, which relied on a strong kind of separation of the natural and supernatural orders, and the notion that you could sort of bracket Maurras's unbelief and his philosophical presuppositions, which were closer to positivism, to Comte, and just get on board with the practical conclusions that he was advocating, the political conclusions he was advocating. And so people like Blondel are totally resistant to that idea that you can separate out the philosophy from the politics. And they argue that when Catholics get on board with this politics, they end up being infected by that atheist philosophy.
Yeah, yeah. And so what was de Lubach's sort of politics? Obviously, he was involved in the opposite of Action Française. He's involved in Catholic action. So
Mhm.
kind of what was that about?
Yeah, so de Lubac is hugely influenced by Blondel. He's probably the most important influence on his
Which
philosophy.
in my book is a good thing.
Yes, yeah, yeah. And Blondel is someone I think who people have forgotten about, but he was enormously important in
Oh,
this.
yeah.
And so he was very much on the same page as Blondel about the Action Française. And Blondel has this wonderful line that I'm gonna butcher, no doubt, but where he talks about how Maurras and the Action Française kind of reduced Catholicism to a set of authority structures without love, right? Without the soul that infuses them. And so they were very much on the same page there. And de Lubac writes a critique of the Action Française and some of the ideas coming out of it. And then it's that kind of critique that he'll then repurpose in the 1940s when he's a leading critic of fascism and of the Vichy government in France, which was the collaborationist government. So
Yeah.
he was a critic of the far right, but also a critic of the left, of communism, and I argue of liberalism in some ways. I mean, he's less overt about that, but I try to make clear that he's in no way arguing for kind of liberal democracy, that he has a political stance that is really resistant to all of the major secular political options. And so, because of that, his approach to politics, I think, asks really interesting questions about the nature of politics, what the role of theology and the church should be in relation to the existing political options.
Yeah, which is going to come out later. I mean, the last couple of sections of your book, the last chapter and then the epilogue, I think are really interesting. I want to dive into those soon with regard to de Lubach's critique of people like Chenu in the post-conciliar context. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The so you okay, so you've got this French political divide,
Mhm.
and it's easy for us now in with 2020 hindsight, and you're an intellectual historian, so you're well aware of this. All right. It's easy for us now to look back through the lens of World War II and all that came after and say, what was wrong with those Action Française people? How could they be monarchists and so on and so forth? And yet the desire for some kind of restoration, which is what, I mean, we give it the name, restorationism. They wanted to restore something that was lost that they valued greatly, which was Catholic France. And Catholic France seemed, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed to them to be like a package deal. All right. It involves church, strict dogma, monarchy, a sort of almost social caste system. You know your state in life, you know your place. And it all worked together to create this organism called Catholic France. And there had to have been a powerful allure to that, especially given how viciously anti clerical the French government was, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and that's a crucial context. Since really the French Revolution, I think this really goes back to the French Revolution, where, one of the first actions after 1789, after the proclamation of the National Assembly and the beginning of the revolution, one of the first things they do is to try to smash the power of the church. They nationalize church property. They established the civil constitution of the clergy, which requires clergy to take an oath of loyalty to the new constitution, and then effectively requires them to choose in some ways in their loyalty to the Pope or their loyalty to France, because the Pope quickly condemns all this. And then, of course, as the revolution becomes more radical, there's grassroots kind of violence against priests. Churches are shut down, and essentially all public worship comes to an end in France in 1793 and 4. And so you can sort of see how Catholics arrive at a suspicion of democratic structures. And this is, of course, reinforced by things like the Risorgimento, the Italian unification, which overtakes the Papal States and so gets rid of the territorial sovereignty of the Vatican. And Germany's Kulturkampf, culture war, led by Bismarck. So, the church sees all these things happening, and it's understandable why they begin to see democracy, liberalism, modern politics, nationalism as inherently dangerous to the church. So I do think it is understandable how
Yeah.
people became, so insistent on the need for a confessional state.
Yeah, and why then the alternative of Catholic action and de Lubach and his confreres that you adopt what you call in your book, and I think rightly so, a counterpolitics. This is sort of apolitical politics that's actually a counterpolitics of some kind. Now, I run a Catholic worker farm, and I'm a huge fan of Dorothy Day. And I would place Dorothy Day within that kind of an almost anarchist, paleo-conservative, localist vision of you effect change by changing culture one brick at a time from below, by way of lived example, by way of the evangelical counsels. But one can perhaps then see why, okay, the debate emerges because why those of the more Action Française bent would view de Lubac and his confreres as maybe defeatists or people willing to make a kind of a sort of flee to the hills kind of Benedict option sort of approach to things, which of course is absurd. I mean, de Lubac was in the resistance for crying out loud, so he wasn't exactly a wallflower through it all. But still, you get my point. And so I see, in other words, parallels, and that's what I'm trying to do here. And for my listeners and viewers, this is not simply a case of esoteric intellectual history. It doesn't translate directly, but there are parallels between that debate and ongoing debates today about what a post-liberal Catholic country would look like and so forth. And that's why I'm pausing here to really sort of hammer away at this point that these were real people, really not cartoonish cardboard cutouts that we look at history. They were really trying to figure out, how does the Catholic Church negotiate the modern world in this sort of now very secular domain? Anyway, that's more of a
Yeah.
comment than a question, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the key, it sort of raises, so after 1926, when the Action Française is condemned by the Vatican, I argue that that kind of opens a space for a wide range of thinkers in France to start experimenting with other possibilities than the idea of just restoring a confessional state and the monarchy. And, for a lot of these figures, and de Lubac included, I think the idea of moving beyond that goal was a kind of liberation. It wasn't just, okay, we're not going backwards. We have to sort of make our peace with this. I think he believed that actually um, refusing the idea of trying to reestablish the church would actually liberate the church and empower the church in certain ways. And
Yeah.
so the reason for that is that he thought, and this is where I think there are some contemporary lessons to be learned, the entanglement of the church with the state was actually a demotion for the church, right? That when the church, he has this wonderful line, though it sounds a little bit better in French, the clericalization of the state is the stateization of the church. So when the church becomes involved
What
in
is it in French? I'd like to hear it in French.
la cléricalisation de l'État, c'est l'étatisation de l'Église.
It
Yeah.
is better in French. Very good.
Étatisation, yeah, is better.
Yeah.
Um, and he has a whole long genealogy of this too in medieval thought and in the development that he tracks in Corpus Mysticum, which is then taken up by historians like Ernst Kantorowicz, which I talk a little bit about. But the idea is that when the church takes on the powers of this world, it is actually reducing its authority to the rank of a worldly authority. And so it's actually a demotion for the church to be doing this kind of thing. And so when it liberates itself from those concerns, it can actually take on a wider spiritual authority such that it can have authority over everything, as he says, without stepping outside of its role. Now, that sounds like a kind of theocracy, but that's not what he's arguing for. He's arguing that this is a spiritual authority. We need to think of it as a spiritual authority, not as a temporal authority. And if we think about it in those terms, then it has authority over everything, and nothing that is human can be foreign from the church. And so that's the basis of what I call his counterpolitics, this idea that the church should be intervening in public life, in public debates, but not at the level of trying to control the state or dominate public policy. And so once we put that aside, then we start to think about, okay, what are the various ways that Catholics can be involved in public life? Can the church and priests and theology be involved in public life that aren't just about changing public policy? And that's where they get creative with ideas like Catholic Action, labor unions, the worker priests, for example. And the resistance, I argue, is a kind of very clear outgrowth of that logic.
And okay, and the worker priests, that was, I mean, the Ressourcement theologians, or the Nouvelle Theologie, gets condemned by Pius XII in 1950 in Humanae Generis, but the worker priests sort of get slapped back by Pius XII as well in the mid 50s, right?
Yep. Yeah. So I argue that those are two slightly different things.
You do.
And so the Dominican side of the story and the Jesuit side of the story are slightly different, or we shouldn't just conflate them. But yes, the worker priests, I mean, so there are all these experiments in kind of left Catholicism, it's sometimes called, immediately after World War II in France, when there's this opening to the left among Catholics that comes in part out of the resistance and the fact that Catholics had worked alongside communists in the ranks of the resistance. And they had gotten to, as is often the case, they had gotten to know these people and realized this is true with Dorothy Day too, that, they're not monsters, that maybe, they care about some of the same things. And so maybe we
Yeah.
need to put aside our theoretical differences and we can agree on some shared practical priorities here. And so there are
Abs
all these experiments that come out, including the worker priests, which is a project to have priests go into the factories and be with the workers, be present to them, instead of just trying to evangelize them. And in many cases, they don't wear clerical robes, they don't perform the sacraments or anything, because they want to truly live the life of the workers, because they think they have to be with the workers in order to be able to reach them.
Kind of reminds me of Simone Weil, who, even though she wasn't a priest, obviously, she just wanted to share the plight of the workers. Probably
Mhm.
worked herself to death. But anyway, once again, I jumped ahead to the 1950s. But before we get there, there are, of course, then, other than the politics, there are theological issues. And so I do prefer, I mean, I'm on the editorial board of Communio. I would consider myself a ressourcement theologian. And as you correctly point out, nouvelle théologie was a pejorative term applied to them, which implied novelty.
Mhm.
This came out of left field. These are the newfangled ideas that are dangerous and allied with modernism. Uh, and so, but guys like de Lubach, Daniel Lu would have thought of themselves. I don't. They wouldn't have called themselves this, but would have thought of themselves as ressourcement thinkers. In other words, back to the sources. What sources? Patristic and scriptural. Uh, some of them were more pointedly anti-Thomistic, others less so. Uh, Nevertheless, as you point out in your book, what we're dealing with here is a kind of division between Augustinians and a retrieval of the church fathers on the one hand, and Thomists on the other. Even the more ressourcement Dominicans were still more Thomistic than patristic. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so that's the main division I track in the book is between these more Thomist figures and Augustinians. And what I try to argue is that we can't see this as like a division between right and left because there are notably Thomist
Yeah.
supporters of the Action Française, as I mentioned. It tended to be associated with the neo-scholastic Thomist theology. And then there's, Thomists on the left who are interested in dialogue with communism. And so and for the Augustinians, so the way I frame it is that the Thomists are sort of both right and left, and the Augustinians are neither right nor left. In other words, they're kind of rejecting all of the possible options. And another way to think about it, because the key to this division, I think, is the relationship of the natural and the supernatural. Um,
Eschatology.
Right. And what I frame as a difference between an emphasis on incarnation and eschatology. So for the Thomists, there is a relatively strong separation between the natural and supernatural orders that emerges from this idea that the human person has two distinct ends, a natural and a supernatural end. And that allows for a relatively autonomous arena of temporal affairs that don't things that don't have the supernatural end is sort of secondary, that their natural
Yeah.
end is primary. And so that allows for a kind of autonomous arena of temporal affairs that are outside the direct jurisdiction of the church. And so the approach of the Augustinians is different in that, as de Lubac argues famously and controversially, humans have only one end, it's supernatural, and that we have a natural desire for the beatific vision that inheres within us. And so we cannot think of humans as having two distinct ends. And so he
Final ends, final ends. De Lubac would say we have multiple ends. One, some are more penultimate, but
right.
there is one final end, and
Yeah.
that's the supernatural end.
Right, right. And consequently, he would resist this kind of dualism between the natural, supernatural, between spiritual and temporal, this tendency to kind of divide and establish an autonomous area that is outside the purview of the church, right? Because as I said, for him, everything is under the authority of the church if we understand that authority in spiritual terms. And so that's really the primary disagreement, I think, between the Dominicans associated with the Nouvelle Theologie and the Jesuits. The Dominicans don't take the kind of strong separation between the natural and supernatural that you see in neo-scholasticism, but it's still kind of in there. And it's crucial, I think, to their engagement with the left, their willingness to work with communists, and also some of their approaches to the modern world at Vatican II. And so I argue that those divisions emerge more prominently in debates over the church's relationship to the modern world at Vatican II.
Well, absolutely. I think that you framed it really well. And Lagrange and the other old guard neo-scholastics eventually get the ear of the powers that be in the Holy Office, still called back then, I think, the Holy Office of the Inquisition, until it gets changed to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. How innocuous is that? I wish it was still called the Holy Office for the Inquisition. At least we'd know what it was about. But anyway, yeah, Lagrange bends the ear of folks in the Holy Office and gets, in a sense, the Nouvelle Theologie placed on their radar as as sort of crypto-modernists, that they're dabbling in the Blondelian universe at the very least, and they're reintroducing notions of subjectivity, historicity, and so forth. And that does not go unnoticed. You quote in your book a great quote from Jean Danielou. I think it was in 1946 in his manifesto about religion, where he just flat out says, I'd never seen this quote before because I had never read Danielou's manifesto. Now I have to go back and read it. But he says essentially, well, Thomism just isn't going to be the philosophical answer that the modern world needs because it essentializes everything and doesn't deal with persons, with subjects. I mean, that's wow, that's a pretty bold statement right there, right?
Mhm. Yeah, no, that it was a pretty radical document, and that document arguably kind of kicked off the crisis over the Nouvelle Theologie because it elicited all this
Yeah.
anger from Thomists.
Well, yeah, he essentially said, yeah, you guys are worthless, so we need
Yeah.
to move on.
Well, his argument there, which is really interesting, I think, is that, and Danielou, I should say, had all kinds of close relationships with kind of secular mainstream philosophers because of his background at the Sorbonne. He had all these
Yeah,
close
yeah,
relationships with leading intellectual figures. Merleau-Ponty, he has a debate with Georges Bataille, Sartre, all these figures he's engaging with. Kojève is another important figure here as well, who's engaging with Catholics. And he argues in that manifesto that actually Thomism cannot engage with the dominant intellectual currents of the day, Marxism and existentialism in the French case, because those were the two kind of main, along with Catholicism, the main intellectual families of post-war France.
right.
And he argues that patristic thought is actually better equipped to engage with modern philosophy because it is more historically sensitive, because it engages with subjectivity, with existence, and because it has a social dimension. And so he argues that Thomism, because it's so essentialist and ahistorical, is not actually well equipped to engage with modern thought. And that's a really interesting point because, and I try to bring this out, it suggests that despite the criticisms of Garrigou-Lagrange and co, that these guys are not just modernists, right? That they actually see the
Right.
pathway to opening up to the modern world is through a ressourcement, through a return to the sources, and that actually paradoxically, by returning to those earliest sources, you can engage better with modern thought on its own terms.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what they were up to. By the way, I think Daniel Liu was wrong. I think Thomism has far deeper resources than he implied for dealing with the realm of not necessarily historicity, but of subjectivity and the personal. You know,
Mhm.
it's strange, and this is a side note, and I know you're interested in the history of science. I've written a book on science and religion. Modern science is kind of rediscovering the importance of form as an organization in quantum physics, in evolutionary biology, that it's not just all reducible down to a God particle that explains everything. There's something bizarre going on metaphysically, even that form is very important. So it could be that Daniel Liu was being a little overheated, but it did create, and my sympathies are with the ressourcement guys, but you want to be fair too. It did create this backflash. So talk about Humane Generis, 1950, and then what happens to guys like de Lubach after Humane Generis?
Right. So this is the encyclical that it was probably authored by Garrigou-Lagrange. And it's the encyclical from Pius XII that effectively condemns the Nouvelle Theologie. It's primarily oriented against the Jesuits in this movement. And it basically accuses them, yes, of engaging too much with modern philosophy. Because one of the things I haven't mentioned, but is a key part of the book, is that even though these figures were very critical of political ideologies, secular political ideologies, they were very open to engaging with modern philosophy and especially existentialism, existential phenomenology. And so I talk a lot in the book about how they are engaging with contemporary phenomenology and how Catholicism is actually kind of central to the development of modern phenomenology. And so the encyclical accuses them of basically making too many concessions to modern philosophy, especially to historicity, and to suggesting that the church doctrine changes over time. And there they fold in people like Teilhard de Chardin as well, and his engagement with science, with evolutionary biology. And so it's this set of ideas that they find particularly problematic. But as I try to point out in the book, key here is their critical remarks about Thomism, that's actually central to the reason they get condemned, because Thomism, as I said, has become this just absolutely central to Catholic orthodoxy by this point, such that you can't, criticize it or
Yeah.
suggest alternatives.
I am not a fan myself of Teilhard de Chardin, either his science or his theology. But de Lubach, of course, was a great defender of Teilhard. Uh, Maybe you could explain that a little bit. It's always puzzled me, and I've always wondered if his defense wasn't simply more of a kind of desire to protect his friend from the Holy Office, in
Hmm.
essence. I don't know.
I don't know. I think that Teilhard de Chardin had actually a really big influence on de Lubac. I set
Now,
this
damn
up.
it, I'd like to think he didn't, but then go ahead and dispel.
Well,
Please
I think
burst my bubble. Go ahead.
part of the resistance to that is probably the fact that, Teilhard has become so associated with Teilhardism, which is something somewhat distinct from what he actually argued,
Yeah,
and is based on the kind of the reception of his thinking after his death in 1955, when all of his works were finally published because he was not allowed to publish during his lifetime. And that led to a kind of a whole weird set of ideas, often kind of new agey ideas in the 1960s, but lots of other things too. And
yeah,
so I think there's a kind of negative association there. But it's important to remember that the Teilhard that de Lubac is reading is quite different. And so he's reading all kinds of things that didn't get published until much later. And he sees a much more religious, mystical thinker, first and
good.
foremost.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right about that. Because I've read some of Taylor's unpublished, untranslated and stuff, and it is fascinating. He's a slippery thinker, but also a deep thinker in his own way.
And I think
Uh,
his personalism becomes very, very influential. So in the second chapter, I try to get into the varieties of different personalist thinking. But his vision of the person becoming more fully themselves as a distinct person by being incorporated into the whole, into Christ,
yeah,
is very influential, I think, on de Lubac's idea of the
the
body.
the the, the element of theosis in there in particular. I know, I'm drawing mainly from the Balthazar's critique of Teilhard, which he didn't like Teilhard very much at all because he viewed mainly his coming together of science and theology, developing a concept of history that was not dramatic, had no theodrama, it had no ernstful moment of decisional crisis. It was all this gradual, sort of inevitable movement towards through the noosphere up to the omega point. And Balthasar just found that sort of suspicious in many ways. But maybe Balthasar is engaging in a caricature of his own. I don't know.
No, I mean, I think that's fair. There are definitely kind of pantheist, I would argue, elements to Teilhard that a lot of people found off-putting, but he was also just is just a creative thinker in this period. There was no one saying things like that, and so that was really influential.
Right. And this is not a sidebar conversation because in some ways what it's establishing once again is establishing a historical mindset. You can see why Rome in 1950 is going to take a look at that and say, "Niet, we're not going down that path. So we're
Mhm.
going to put the kibosh on all of this conversation." Now, de Lubac does not get silenced by the Vatican, but he sort of gets sidelined by his own Jesuit order for he can't publish. And what else couldn't he do?
He couldn't teach,
Yeah.
he couldn't publish, and well, he could publish on certain things, and he needed to go through an extra layer of censorship. And some of his books are removed from circulation, basically, along with
Well,
some of the figures.
right. But the last chapter of your book before the epilogue, which I think is by itself worth the whole price of the book, which isn't that expensive, by the way, it is basically the death and resurrection of the Nouvelle Theologie, because Humane Generis seems to have put the death nail to the Nouvelle Theologie, and yet it was a short-lived death. because a mere like 10 years later, John the 23rd comes to power, and all of a sudden, rising from the dustbin of of history are de Lubach and Yves Congar, and John the 23rd says, "Hey, let's have an ecumenical council." And these guys are suddenly put on theological commissions and so forth. So maybe you could talk a bit about. I mean, what do you think John the 23rd was deliberately? I do was deliberately doing this to sort of, in a way, signal. Well, I'm not going to publicly say I disagree with Pius the 12th, but I'm here going to rehabilitate these guys, and in so doing, I'm making a statement about what I want this council to be.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he didn't have to put them on the theological commission. And, as I mentioned in the book, there were moments when, de Lubac almost quit because he's working under the same people who had condemned him, and they are trying to actually insert into the preparatory documents explicit condemnations of his thought. And so it was pretty vexed.
Cardinal Ottaviani had
Yes.
no shame, although he was. But all accounts I've read of Ottaviani was that in person he was a very magnanimous, wonderful, gracious, kind man, and also a very intelligent man. But he had no time for de Lubac or that crowd.
No, or Teilhard, yeah. So it was a difficult experience being on the theological commission. But what I try to stress in the book is that the rehabilitation was really unanticipated. And that's true of the council in general, I think, right? There's a real kind of plot twist in how the council develops. Because when John the 23rd calls the council, he puts Congar and de Lubac on the preparatory commission, but there are these kind of outsider fringe figures. Ottaviani is really controlling all of the draft documents, and they're very much in this kind of neo-scholastic style.
Yeah.
But what happens when the Council Fathers all come together in 1962 is that there's a kind of revolt against these drafts. And in part, it's because you have some of these theologians that the bishops and cardinals are bringing with them as advisors, people like Joseph.
Joseph Ratzinger.
Yeah. Who are whispering in their ear and saying this is no good. But basically the bishops vote down these draft documents and say, no, this is not what we want. We don't want this kind of, they literally say this kind of frigid, juridical, ahistorical language.
Right.
We want something different. And so then the documents are sent back to new commissions to rewrite them. And it's in this process that people like Congar, especially, but also de Lubac, Chenu, and
Gerard Phillips,
some
very
of the
important
younger
figure.
generations of people who were influenced by the Nouvelle Theologie, like Ratzinger, become key to rewriting these documents.
Yeah, very, very key. I mean, like I always bring up the name of Monsignor Gerard Phillips because he's a name that very, very few people have heard of Ratzinger and Cardinal Frings, but Gerard Phillips was this guy behind the scenes, but who had a direct hand in writing so many he was a conciliator. Whenever, especially when John the 23rd dies and Paul the Sixth takes over, Paul the Sixth is very, very, very keen on reconciling all of these factions at the council to create a document that everybody can agree upon. And Gerard Phillips had a huge role in smoothing over those differences.
Absolutely. No, I think that's absolutely right. And they were considerable.
Oh, yeah, considerable differences, especially for things like, the Catholic Church, the Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church. Now, Congar had a big hand in that, correct?
Yes, so I think his influence, I mean, I can't remember, I quote the number of documents that he was involved in, but it was some,
Oh,
insane number.
large. I was surprised by that. I knew he was
Yeah.
involved in a lot, but then you quoted this number 16, 17, something or
Yeah.
other. It's like, wow, are you
Yeah,
kidding me?
yeah, yeah. And he wrote like large sections of them. And he has a wonderful journal from the council where you can get his kind of thoughts on what's happening. And so he's really important, I think, for the ecumenical sensibility. I don't do enough with Congal probably in the book. The Dominicans are admittedly sort of secondary to the Jesuits in the story. But he's hugely influential on those kind of ecumenical pronouncements, on ecclesiology, the people of God ecclesiology for sure.
Yeah,
He is
yeah.
an absolutely central figure.
One of the most misunderstood concepts of Lumen Gentium is the people of God, I think. because it is all too often, even in some of the documents of the Synod on Synodality, the Instrumentum Laboris and so throw the phrase people of God around as a synonym for simply the laity,
Mhm.
as a synonym for turning the laity into this sort of polity that are sort of set, not necessarily in an adversarial way, but set against the hierarchy. So
Mhm.
there's the church of the people of God and the hierarchy. Congar's ecclesiology, however, was more of a communio ecclesiology that wanted to emphasize there is hierarchy in the church, but the hierarchy is part of this communio that is reflective of the Trinitarian communio. And we are all, therefore, pilgrim people. We are all the people of God. And so the initial usage, and de Lubach notes this in his stuff on Vatican II, was you're going back to the church fathers and you're using this concept of the people of God to emphasize how everyone in the church is on pilgrim, not to differentiate between laity and hierarchy.
Mhm. No, I think that's right. I think it was deliberately designed to de-emphasize those distinctions and think about us as all part of the same community, for sure.
Yeah, and so you get this rehabilitation of the ressourcement guys in Vatican II. Okay, but now this is where I think your last chapter and then into the epilogue gets really, really interesting. Not that the rest of it, like I said to you off camera, I said, you know that you're an intellectual theological history nerd when you pick up a book like this and it's a page turner. I think I read it in like 2 or 3 nights where it's staying up like a little kid reading a comic book under his covers with the flashlight. It's like I can't stop reading this book. I'm telling you folks, get this book. It is that good. But the last couple of chapters were just like, oh my God. I ended up underlining everything because you get to the section on Gaudium et Spes, and this has been a hobby horse of mine for a long time. I mean, my blog is called Gaudium et Spes 22, the famous quote in GS 22 about, it's only in the light of the incarnation of Christ that the mystery of man, takes on its true colors, its meaning, uh, which is a phrase that is more Lubachian, Voitian than Congarian and so forth. So what fascinates me about Gaudium et Spes, and you bring this out in your book, is that the clear fault lines of what is later to emerge in the post-conciliar church, the fault lines of a division between different schools of thought within ressourcement. Forget the scholastics. They've sort of been, they're still there. They're still important, but they've pretty much been left behind as major players. The players are the ressourcement guys. But Gaudium et Spes shows us that the ressourcement crowd, they're not on the same page. And then that plays out after the council, Concilium versus Communio. And so maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I try to, in a way, I try to have the first part of the book explain where those divisions come from. So, like that distinction I was talking about between Thomists and Augustinians, between a logic of incarnation, of wanting to work within secular structures to make change, versus a logic of eschatology, which is much more kind of critical and wants to kind of stand at arm's length from secular movements and ideologies. Those divisions between the Jesuits and Dominicans come out in the debates around Gaudium et Spes and what the church's attitude should be to the modern world. Obviously, all of these people want to engage with the modern world in some way. That's kind of foundational to their thinking, but they have different views about how this should take place, what elements are worth engaging. And generally, what comes out is in these discussions is there's a group associated, especially with Chenu, Skillebeck's, and some of those figures that would then go on to be associated with Concilium, who are much more open to engaging with the world outside of the church, with modernity, with opening the church up to the modern world, and then figures like de Lubach, Wojtyła, Ratzinger, who are Danielou, who are much more kind of skeptical of the value of secular modernity and that it can kind of eat away at the kind of evangelical fervor or ferment of the church. And so they're emphasizing, as you point out, the kind of Christological dimensions of Gaudium et Spes. They want to put that front and center. And what I try to show in the book is this isn't really just a division between progressives and conservatives, which is usually how it's framed in the
Right.
nowadays. That if we understand this longer history, we actually see that this is not a political division, but a division between different theological approaches, essentially, between this more kind of incarnationist view and this more eschatological one, and that de Lubac makes the same critique of these figures as he does of people on the right earlier on. And so there's a continuity there that belies any notion of a kind of progressive conservative binary.
Yeah, what is interesting is that well, so many things are interesting. First, I always find it interesting. It's the Thomists that end up being the more progressive wing of things, and it's the Augustinians that end up being a little more, I mean, traditional and eschatological in their approach to things. So, because I mean, these days, I mean, if you say, "Oh, he's a Thomist," that implies, well, he's a stick in the mud restorationist, something or other. I don't know. It implies different things. Different people. You get my point. That it. No one would sit back and say he's a Thomist. Oh, he must be very progressive,
That's
and that would not immediately leap to your mind. But that is what happens here. But the
true.
the other thing that the other thing that kind of strikes me about what's going on here is that guys like Ratzinger and de Lubac and even Daniel Lew and then Jacques Maritain, after the council, they all start writing these, even Louis Boyer and others, they all start writing. They were thought to be liberals by the neo-scholastics, by
Mhm.
Humane Janus, sorry. And now all of a sudden they're lamenting this turn towards a more progressive opening to the world. As you point out in the book, de Lubac says you cannot have aggiornamento without a turn to tradition. Tradition implies aggiornamento. Aggiornamento implies tradition. And so what de Lubac, and it would be the same for Ratzinger, Maritain, and others, what he's essentially accusing the Concilium school with is having aggiornamento but no tradition. That is an opening to the world that now starts to go beyond a simple desire to engage the world. You are very interested, I know, and it comes out in the book, but I've also read elsewhere that you're very interested in the secularization, the theology in a sense of secularization. I mean, Chenu, Skillebeck, and others start to come out and say, "Hey, look, the secular world, this is the child of Christianity. This is, whether it knew it or not, what Christianity was tending towards. Maybe Christianity was always destined to, in a sense, transcend itself into something else." And I think de Lubac and others are seeing this, that a non-ecclesial ecclesiality, a non-religious, as Bonhoeffer would say, a non-religious Christianity, that's sort of what is in play here in this more incarnational view, has Rahnerian overtones, right? The world is always already engraced with salvific movements of God, so we need to break down these false barriers between inside and outside the church. We need to develop a pluralism of religions model, and so on and so forth. And so, boom, on to Hans Kung, onto into the future.
Yes, and Gutierrez, right? Because that idea.
Gautier, oh yeah, we got to talk about that. But go ahead.
Yeah, so no, I think that's right. Like, and this comes out. I mentioned some of the writings from Chenu in the 40s, where he's talking about this idea that maybe secularization is a manifestation of grace, right? That the development of human agency and freedom needs to be seen as a kind of manifestation of grace. And so that's a super interesting idea, but it's very far from what de Lubac would be arguing, where I think they would actually agree in some ways that, like de Lubac, a lot of his critiques of neo-scholasticism is about the way that Christian theology kind of set the foundations for secularization, especially in the Middle Ages, with the kind of dualism, with the
Yeah.
separation of nature, supernature. So that then, when you have this idea of pure nature, that becomes kind of self-contained, and then you no longer need God. And so he does have a really robust critique of the way that Catholic theology, in a way, wrote its own kind of death sentence, but he thinks that's a bad thing, obviously. Whereas I think people like Chenu would say, well, maybe there's something beneficial in this, and maybe we can find
Yeah.
elements of grace in these other religions and these other kind of secular movements that aren't explicitly Christian. Um,
And it really, yeah, this is so fascinating to me, Dr. Shortall, because I just see so many resonances with what's going on today, and it makes me feel a great pity for and sadness towards Pope Leo the 14th because he has so much on it. I love this new Pope, uh, and he has so much on his plate because, as in the article I'm writing now is trying to point out, all of these issues that began way back, with the exile of the Jesuits and the Dominicans on through the Second Vatican Council, the fissures that emerged between Concilium and Communio. The pontificates of John Paul and Benedict spin it towards the Lubachian thing. The pontificate of Pope Francis spins it more towards Chenu, Congar, Skillabex. I mean, for all the sort of rhetoric of continuity, this was the tension, really, between JP2 Benedict on the one hand and Pope Francis on the other. It reflects the tensions between Concilium and Communio greatly, even though, Francis was also heavily influenced by the Communio thinkers. Now you get Leo the 14th. The choice of name is very interesting because you just said earlier, one of the intents of Pope Leo the 13th in a sense, reasserting Thomism was hopefully to open the church up towards dialogue with the outside world. So it's not just rerum novarum in the social justice tradition. I'm hoping that Leo the 14th views his pontificate as, in some ways, destined to try and finally find a reconciliation between the incarnational and the eschatological, between Concilium and Communio. Because to me, this strikes me as the great unresolved theological issue of our day, the relationship between Christological and ecclesial particularity and the movement of God's grace everywhere in the broader world. Extra ecclesiam nulla salus, very narrowly interpreted or very broadly interpreted. This is an ongoing debate within the church, which isn't going to go away with repressive techniques or whatever. It's got to be resolved theologically, it seems to me. And your book is just genius at threading the needle of what these distinctions were, I think.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the new pope has a lot of challenges to deal with, and in some ways, I think actually the polarization between these sides has only increased, and so it's become even harder, possibly, to bring them back together. To say nothing, of course, of the global diversity of the church, which is another component that is very difficult to
Yeah, I
deal
know your next book. Let's get to that. You're writing a book on Catholicism, I think, in some sort of what does it mean to be Catholic in this new global context? And this relates directly to everything we've been talking about here today. It's what Pope Francis was. I mean, you can go back to John the 23rd and Pacem in Terris, and then you find that there were more progressive types helping write Gaudiem et Spes who wanted it to be more like Pacem in Terris. Then you get Fratelli Tutti, which was more like Pacem in Terris. And I think it's all an attempt in some ways to address this question that, as Ratzinger himself pointed out, that's really been festering since the discovery of the New World, and that the world didn't consist of the Mediterranean basin with India over here, India and China over here. That how do we square this circle of particularity versus universalism? And so I can't wait to read your next book on the church in a global. It may not be addressing my concerns, but maybe you could talk about this project a little bit.
Yeah, so it did actually come out of this book, and funnily enough, the stuff that I wrote about Teilhard de Chardin was the kind of pivot for this because I found this book that Leopold Senghor had written about Teilhard. So Senghor is the first president of Senegal. He was a major figure in the Negritude literary movement. And so an important kind of intellectual and politician. And he was a huge fan of Teilhard de Chardin. And I thought this was really curious. And he actually argued that Teilhard provided a kind of alternative to the extremes of Marxism and Negritude, that he kind of could synthesize the best of those two traditions and provide the pathway to a kind of distinctly African socialism that would be more open to religion than the European Marxist tradition, and also to a view of globalization that would allow for the unique value of particular cultures, the particular contribution of distinct cultures. And so that was kind of the starting point for me to think about, okay, instead of just trying to write a kind of global history of Catholicism, as some people have tried to do, I'm interested in how have Catholics imagined the global? How have they imagined the global as a concept, a theological concept, a political concept, an economic and environmental concept, and how has that interacted with secular forms of global consciousness rooted in, economics and capitalism, let's say, or technology rooted in international law. So I have an article out on Teilhard's influence at the United Nations, which was quite considerable. And what exactly are Catholics bringing to the table there, and how have they interacted with these other visions of global consciousness? And part of that, I think, involves thinking about, the ecclesia too, right? What does it mean to be a global church? How do we think about the role of unity versus difference within that? So I am going to try to engage a bit with some of these third world theologians, as they called themselves, who were trying to think through these questions about
That's
how to
fascinating.
develop a contextual theology that was nevertheless still universal.
You see, this is why I love doing these interviews because I get so challenged. You get, especially at age 66, you start to get channelized and you think you know everything. And, I've never been a huge fan of Taylor. And here you are sort of convincing me maybe I need to go back and read this feller again and and read secondary literature more about him than to simply dismiss him. So thank you for that. So now I've got a whole new reading project on my hands. So that's great, and I think it's important. And I'm not just saying this out of a sense of false humility. That, oh geez, I learned something. This is so important that we remain sort of open to this world of ideas, and that we're able to say maybe I've misjudged something and maybe I need to go back and take a look. Along those lines, I wanted to talk about Gutierrez. We kind of jumped ahead to but I forgot to bring him up. I remember when I was at Fordham, I took a couple of courses in liberation theology by the late great Al Henley, a Jesuit who wrote a lot about liberation theology. And of course, I read everybody, Gutierrez, Segundo, Sobrino, Leonardo Boff, and several others. My favorite of all of them was Gutierrez.
Hmm.
My least favorite was Segundo, but my favorite was Gutierrez because I sensed in him a real. Of course, all these guys were educated under the Ressourcement guys in Europe, which is kind of your point in the book, which is that Gutierrez and these others take Ressourcement theology they learned in Europe and they place it in a different context, and they end up coming up with a politics that's a little more direct and not quite so much a counter politics. So let's talk about that before we end here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that so the in the epilogue I trace, in addition to some of the developments in secular academic culture that have engaged with some of the same ideas about secularization and political theology, I also talk about developments in Catholic theology that I think come out of these figures. And so liberation theology on the one hand, and then radical orthodoxy on the other, both of which I think are very much indebted to these figures, and they arrive at somewhat
And
different.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but you put Bill Kavanaugh in the radical orthodoxy wing. Yeah, I know Bill. He's a good guy. Uh,
Yeah. I mean,
but yeah, I think you're right about that.
he's sort of complicated. I mean, he's very Lubachian, but he is complicated, in relation to someone like Milbank, because I think their politics are slightly different. But I would say that
Yeah.
both of them, and this is, part of the point, is both of them really refuse that right-left division that comes out of secular
Yeah, I've
politics.
been very influenced by Bill Kavanaugh. That's why
Yeah.
I asked the question. But anyway, back to Gutierrez and the
Yeah,
liberation
no, I'm
guys.
I'm a big fan of his, and his new book looks really exciting about idolatry,
It
which I
is. It's great. I love it.
talk about. Yeah. And Gutierrez and liberation theology, because they studied with these ressourcement figures in Europe. Gutierrez studied with de Lubach in the 50s. He was also close to Chenu and Congar. They're sort of developing, especially this idea of breaking down the dualism of nature supernature, and moving beyond what he calls the distinction of planes model, which he associates with Maritain, with Catholic action, as it manifests itself in Latin America, especially, which he thought had only served the interests of the elites, that the whole gesture of being at a remove from politics and saying we're not doing politics actually was a political choice in the Latin American context because it involved reinforcing the power of the elites. So his argument is that in this particular context, all theology is political, even when you're claiming not to do politics, which is part of what the point of my book is about, is that,
Yeah.
even the claim to be not doing politics can have political power in certain contexts. And so they kind of make that
Yeah.
explicit.
You are very careful in your book not to make your own sort of political convictions known. But I think reading between the lines, that you're kind of like me. I'm not a liberation theologian, but I have a deep sympathy in my soul, having been in Latin America and been amongst the campesinos and some of the more poverty-stricken areas in an era when I was there in an era during the Reagan years of, goon squads, and the anti-Marxist goon squads of various juntas and so forth. You do develop a sympathy for their point of view that, you know, uh, Chile under Pinochet is not France. It's not France of the 1930s. Okay, and it's a different kettle of fish, and so you do have to develop different models of discourse. Now, all that being said, I wonder what you think. I mean, Leonardo Boff's brother just came out recently and said, liberation theology was great, but now Latin America is converting to evangelical, Pentecostal, Protestant sects of various kinds. So maybe, just maybe, in our mad rush for social justice and the translation of the gospel into a political platform, maybe we left the supernatural and the transcendent behind, and people are now voting with their feet and going off to religions that give them a more immediate experience of the supernatural. Um, I have a certain sympathy with that critique, but I don't know if it's true.
Mhm. Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, this comes out of Vatican, the debates about Vatican II as well, because of course
Yeah,
post Vatican II, there's this huge wave of secularization in Europe and North America. The pews empty out, vocations decline, and of course, it becomes this political thing where each side blames the other, right, for secularization. I think
absolutely.
empirically, it's somewhat difficult to say what the reason is. But I do think there is a risk sometimes and this was something de Lubach was very attuned to, in the politicization of the faith that you alienate some people, right? That ends up kind of narrowing in some ways the purchase of the faith by yoking it to a particular political project. Personally, I'm more sympathetic with the liberation theologians in terms of their politics. Intellectually, I find de Lubach's arguments more persuasive.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's a bit of a disjuncture
No,
there.
I am.
But yeah, that's always a risk. And I think one of the things I appreciate about all of these figures is that they're very attentive to the fact that that Catholicism has to have some political power or
Yeah,
political purchase, that it is that we are living in a society, that we are people in the world, that the incarnation has happened, that what we do in this world matters, and that it can't just be written off. But on the other hand, that you can't just sort of conflate religion and politics and deduce your political positions directly from your faith. And so they're living in the space between those two imperatives. And the willingness to hold those two things in tension is, I think, the key. And it's a key that a lot of people forget, and especially today, in their willingness to sort of rush into politicizing the faith. And I think that's a tension that we need to really hold on to.
I agree. I think the flaw in Boff's brothers' analysis is that it's not multifocal enough, as you're correctly pointing out here. Uh, and it ignores the fact that it might be actually a sign of bourgeois well-being that people now have the opportunity to sort of choose amongst various consumer choices in the religious domain. And to a certain extent, that's the fruit of the fact that the church fought for social justice for the past 50 years in those regions, that you do now have a more democratic and a more stable political environment, in maybe with the exception of Venezuela, in Latin America, certainly in Central America. Well, I don't know. Nicaragua and El Salvador are still kind of a mess, but nevertheless, uh, it is. I think goes without saying that the church did have a very positive influence on the politics down there. So I think you're correct. We can't collapse it to politics, and yet we can't utterly divorce them either.
I think Gutierrez, to his credit, was better at that than many people,
That's why I liked him.
Yeah, I mean, he
He
wasn't
seemed
one
the
of these,
most Catholic of them.
yeah, he wasn't one of these sort of, Marxist guerrillas. He was very kind of thoughtful, I think, about his engagement with European philosophical traditions of
Very
existentialism.
much so. It says a lot, right, that he's good buddies, was good buddies with Cardinal Mueller, the
Mhm.
the arch conservative critic of Pope Francis, the German, the Cardinal Mueller. All right, and he is good buddies with Gutierrez, and I think that says a lot. I think that says more about Gutierrez than Mueller, although it speaks well to Mueller as well. But
Mhm.
anyway, I was very appreciative of that small section there about liberation theology in your book because I think it's necessary to bring that in as well as radical orthodoxy. And that sort of maybe we can sort of end on this conversation, which is that uh, one of the things about that I often like to say about communio theology or resourcement theology is that unlike the commentatorial tradition that arose around Aquinas and then later becomes scholastic neo-scholasticism, I think, in my view, what we want to avoid, from my perspective, is a sort of ressourcement scholasticism developing, where we simply develop commentaries on De Lubach, commentaries on Balthasar, commentaries on Danielou, where we keep going back to the originating masters and just, repeating what they said. When in point of fact, I think that ressourcement theology, going back to this, should be out there generating a new generation of thinkers. And I think you see that in guys like Bill Kavanaugh, the radical orthodoxy, liberation theologians to an extent. All right.
Mhm.
Now there's and I kind of see you even as a historian as sort of part of that.
Yeah, I mean, because I'm not a theologian, I'm not as invested in sort of the normative applications of some of these ideas. But I do think, in a way, sort of like the Husvil gesture, I think there is something valuable in historicizing these figures and sort of understanding them within their
Yeah.
context, because I think we get a better sense of what they were doing, and especially with someone like de Lubac, who I think has gotten a certain reputation largely because of the post-Vatican II views of him and how he is
Yeah.
slotted into those debates. People then forget about the earlier stuff that I think is crucial to understanding who he was and the fact that he was really radical when
Yeah.
he was, first writing and condemned by the church, and so I think understanding that context is crucial, and especially because theologians, and no shade against theologians, but they often don't do archival research, or they're
Really?
you're not always able to access, um, some of this sources in their original language. So especially for the figures around the Lubach who have not been translated, like Fessard, for example, we're missing something, I think, when we overlook these figures, or we get a kind of richer sense. Like as I was saying with Teilhard, I think we get a much richer sense of his influence when we understand what was happening pre the kind of subsequent development of Teilhardism and the circulation of his unpublished manuscripts amongst French Catholics. So understanding kind of where they're coming from
Yeah.
is crucial, I think, to understanding what they were doing. And the other thing that I think is valuable about taking a historical lens is that, because I'm not really invested in the normative consequences, I think I can take a little bit of a step back and try to think with a kind of historical empathy about these figures and try to understand what they were trying to do on their own terms rather than judging whether I agree with it or not. And
Yeah.
that kind of historical empathy is, I think, an attitude of mind that is worth cultivating, especially in an age of great polarization.
I could not agree with that more, and that's probably the best way to end this. By the way, I've seen Teilhard's grave, which now sits on the grounds of a culinary school
Yes.
in New York. I guess it used to be a Jesuit institution that the Culinary Institute of America bought up, and I remember I went to the Culinary Institute just to go to dinner, and I'd say a friend of mine said, "Well, yeah, Teilhard's buried over there." I thought, "What the hell is this?" But
Yeah,
anyway, yeah, it only
I've
goes to
also
show
heard a little bit of trivia that he's the inspiration for the priest in the movie The Exorcist.
he was. I think I've seen that same interview where that connection is made. Anyway, oh my goodness, I can't emphasize enough, people, how great this book is. Soldiers of God in a Secular World, Catholic Theology and 20th Century French Politics. I don't care what your politics or your theology are, as she has correctly pointed out, knowing the detailed history of and the background of all the debates that we're all engaged in right now in the church is so necessary in order to give it all its proper context. So, Dr. Shortall, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure to have this conversation.
Yeah, I hope I wasn't too intrusive with all my
Not at
ramblings.
all. Not at all.
Okay. And thanks everybody for listening. Bye now.